gentlemen, my name is Aaron Blade, and I am the editor, creator, and producer of what you're watching right now, Blade Talk. If you are new here, welcome, and you found this presentation helpful, informative, do me a huge favor and hit that like button. Do me an even greater favor and subscribe to my channel. I always appreciate all the support that I am given. So today I'm going to continue in the Jewish history series, going over part 2. If you have not seen part 1, I encourage you to stop here and go check that out. For the rest of us, let's hit that intro and let's begin. Alright, so here we are picking up on the previous presentation that I did. Now, the next step in this presentation is going over the next 1500 years of Jewish history. And the first presentation I covered the first 2000. And now in this presentation, I'm going to cover 1500. Now, keep in mind that I'm not diving in too deeply. I'm not going to go into the midrash and things like that. This is just for people that want a synopsis or a crash course into Jewish history to give them a better understanding. So, with that in mind, let's tackle the next 500 years, okay? So, I like to call this period the national formation. It took 500 years from the birth of Abraham to standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, ready to accept our national mandate from God. This is 500 years, and these 500 years can be divided into two main sections. Building a dynasty, which was 290 years. This is where we have individuals who are really becoming the first family of the Jewish people. And just to name them, we have Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel and Leah, and of course along with their maidservants. All together, they have 12 sons, which grow into the 12 tribes of Israel. Now again, if you want to deep dive into these individuals, please refer to the crash course of the Torah that I did, which I will link in the comments section down below. Now the other 210 years are going to be spent in Egypt. So let's understand what this Jewish family is really about. So the first thing to really appreciate is that it wasn't one individual that started the whole thing and then got other people to join in. It was an entire family, and these 7 individuals were quite remarkable. First of all, they were brilliant intellects. Abraham himself was the one who rationalized that there must be one God. It didn't make sense that the world works in disunity by a myriad of different forces ruling over the universe. He rationalized the idea of one God and then started to influence the rest of the world. So they were brilliant intellects. Secondly, they were courageous revolutionaries. They were willing to take this idea of one God and spread it to others. They tried to get others to believe in the concept of one God, and in doing so, actually took tremendous risks. They were seen as outsiders in the different nations they had to travel in. They were also respected leaders. Whether it was the Pharaoh in Egypt or the leaders of the Philistines, these individuals from this family were seen as princes and princesses amongst the people. They were also spiritual giants. They were able to take the ideas of humanity and express in great levels of commitment to one's fellow and take tremendous risks. Finally, they were faithful servants. They were willing to go on a journey to build a nation. Imagine you and your spouse going out to start a nation. It's rather hard to see it come together, but that is what these individuals were willing to do and follow God's directives. So, this is the founding family of the Jewish people. The trick is, how do you turn a family like that into a nation where you have millions of people that have the same level of commitment, or at least that type of commitment, but as a group? Obviously, you can't make a cookie cutter type nation where everyone is going to think the same way. Nevertheless, you're going to have a fabric of a nation where the same commitment underlies the national resolve to go and manage throughout history despite tremendous challenges. So, what is going to build this family into a nation? Well, it was the experience in Egypt. This 210 years is really understood in Jewish tradition as the crucible that turned them into a nation that could perpetuate one generation after the next, a commitment that would survive the challenges of history. So let's look at Egypt more specifically. The experience in Egypt was 210 years. 94 years, we have a gradual assimilation where the Jews went from being these great individuals into, unfortunately, assimilating to the culture that they were living amongst. Then we have 116 years of slavery following that. So this is what the Jews went through. We were living amongst the most powerful nation on earth, and it was also the most impure nation on earth. In fact, tradition says it descended to the 49th level of impurity, and there are only 50 levels of what is called spiritual impurity. The Jewish people were almost completely ruined to the 50th level of impurity. They were at the 49th level before they were redeemed from Egypt. The Egyptians, as their masters, were very cruel, and they were committed to trying to destroy the Jewish people's resolve to grow as a nation or to reproduce. They try to crush their spirits in any way they possibly could. Again, I will refer you to my crash course in Torah if you would like a deep dive into what happened. So God comes to Moses later on in his life to redeem the Jewish people. When Pharaoh refuses, God brings on 10 plagues to Egypt. The first 3 shows God's absolute control over the land and the water with blood, frogs, and lice. The next 3 plagues show God's absolute control over everything that walks the earth, with wild animals, pestilence, and boils. The next 3 plagues show God's control over the heavens, with the hail, locusts, and darkness. The final plague, which forces the Egyptians to surrender, is the death of the firstborn. Now keep in mind how significant this was. In the ancient world, the firstborn was really the political class. All the power went to the firstborn of the family, so to see that entire class being wiped out in one night was a huge blow to the Egyptians. Now, it is important to point out something that most don't know. These plagues lasted an entire year. Egypt was going through this for a year, and at the same time, the Jews are witnessing this incredible nation fall apart piece by piece. This is when the nation of Israel is born, and it is important to appreciate the 3 major events that culminate the birth of the Jewish people. First, we have the liberation from Egypt. That mass exodus We never had that before in history, that a slave nation should actually be freed and establish its own nation. 7 days later, we have a moment of deliverance where the sea split and we are able to pass on dry land. Then 50 days after getting out of Egypt, we are standing at the foot of Mount Sinai getting a national revelation. This is where we accept the Torah and we become God's nation. Okay, now let's go through the next 1,000 years. Now, this is a huge chunk of time. This is almost 1/3 of our national history. Now, another way to look at this period is to call it national prophecy, meaning it was an era in which we had many prophets. Just to appreciate this, many religions have one prophet and they're in business. They're good to go. The Jewish people during this 1,000-year period, tradition says, had over 1 million prophets. And in fact, there were schools where people could go if they wanted to become a prophet. They could be schooled on how to achieve prophecy and things like that. Prophecy is the ability for one to communicate with God and have this connection, this communication with God in a very special way. So prophecy is the highest spiritual achievement one could obtain in a world where the goal is to develop a strong relationship with God. Now, there are 3 types or goals of prophecy. One was to deepen the prophet's understanding, wisdom, and relationship with God. The second goal of prophecy was to provide personal or national guidance. Someone could go to a prophet for something as mundane as they lost their donkey and they don't know where it is. The prophet would be told where the donkey is. Of course, they were also advisors to kings, giving them national guidance. Should we go to war or not? How should we deal with situations within the nation, etc.? The prophet would guide the king and the leadership. The third goal for prophets was to deliver messages that were relevant for all generations. Things we need to be aware of in the future in terms of our character or moral faults that we need to correct. So let's get back to breaking down the 1,000 years. We have 40 years in the desert. Then we have 850 years in the land of Israel. That is a tremendous amount of time. I always like to point out that Israel has seen many empires rise and fall. The Roman Empire was around for just about 5 centuries, and here we are in the land of Israel for 850 years. Now, 440 of those years are pre-temple. We have the tabernacle that was in various stages of development in different places that the Jews would worship God there, whether it was in Gilgal or Shiloh, etc. But for 440 years, we did not have a permanent place for God to dwell. Then we entered the First Temple period, which stood for 410 years. It was built by King Solomon. It was built in the year 832 BCE and stood for 4 centuries. And we will talk about the temples in a future presentation, but I just want to make sure that you get the timeline down for now. Now, unfortunately, the Jewish people are backsliding. We're going to get caught up in idolatry. We are warned again and again by the prophets to come back to God and fulfill our end of the deal. We don't listen, and eventually the temple is destroyed by the Babylonians led by Nebuchadnezzar. Then we went into our first exile into the land of Babylon, and that was a 70-year period. The prophets actually told us that it would last for 70 years. Eventually, Babylon is conquered by the Persians, and we are allowed to return under King Cyrus. We have the first 40 years of the Second Temple period. The Second Temple stood for 420 years. Now, what I want to go over is what the prophets were talking about and what they were trying to get through to us. So, there were three major institutions that changed our national psyche and identity. The first was the land of Israel. We finally come into the land, and the Jewish people fall in love with the land. Joshua leads us into the land, and then the book of Judges deals with various leaders from different tribes who led the Jewish people. They weren't kings, but whenever the Jewish people strayed too far from the Torah, these judges would lead us back or help us fight a war with a neighboring nation to ensure our survival and moral superiority. The judges you probably heard of were Samson, Gideon, Deborah the prophetess, etc. So the book of Joshua and Judges help us understand our relationship to the land of Israel. The second institution is the monarchy, to establish a king within the nation of Israel. Now the Torah actually commands that when we come into the land and we settle there, we are to establish a king. Unfortunately, the Jewish people asked prematurely for a king, and they are really looking for a king to be like all the other nations instead of having a spiritual and wise leader. The first king we get is King Saul, which is all told in the book of Samuel. Samuel was an elder statesman at the time and was also a prophet. He's going to usher in this new era. Samuel 1 covers King Saul's reign, but unfortunately, King Saul won't live up to God's standards. He's going to lose his kingship to King David. David at this time appears as a young man who slays a Philistine man named Goliath. He becomes very popular amongst the people, and eventually Saul is consumed with jealousy and tries to kill David. Eventually, King Saul is killed in war, and Samuel 2 talks about the reign of King David. Now, King David is actually the ideal Jewish king. God establishes a covenant with him that the kingship will always come from his line, the Davidic dynasty. In fact, the future Messiah will be a direct descendant from King David. King David is not only a great leader and king, but also a great philosopher, scholar, and poet. He had a very difficult life, and his poetry from the book of Psalms, which he wrote, has been the foundation of many Jewish prayers and the way we express ourselves to God. One of the greatest visions of King David leads us into the third institution, which is the temple. At this point, God was still dwelling in somewhat temporary residence, and King David felt it was inappropriate for him to have this massive palace to sleep in each night, but the king of the universe had no permanent place to dwell. So King David is the one who establishes Jerusalem as the political and spiritual capital of the Jewish people. God does not allow King David to build the temple because God wants the temple to be a place of peace. King David, being a warrior, had too much blood on his hands. Therefore, it is going to be King David's son, Solomon, that builds it. King Solomon in Hebrew is Shlomo, which is the root of shalom, which means peace. So King Solomon was the perfect person to build the first temple. So Kings 1 and 2 go over the building and destruction of the temple by the Babylonians. Now again, I'm just scratching the surface with this. I won't dive too deep. This is just to get your feet wet into Jewish history and give you a timeline. Now, before I wrap up this presentation, I want to give you all a deeper insight into prophecy because many don't understand why prophecy ended. So to understand why prophecy ended, we first must understand the men of the Great Assembly, also known as the Sanhedrin. It is the supreme court of the Jewish people. We experience prophecy this entire period until the beginning of the Second Temple period. There was a major shift when we came back from the first exile. Remember that we spent 70 years in Babylon, so the Sanhedrin had a huge issue, and to understand this issue, we have to understand a philosophical concept central to Torah law. So stay with me. We can divide the ancient world into two philosophical systems. On one hand, there was the Torah, represented by the Jewish people, and on the other was paganism, which was represented by everyone else in the world. Now, the Torah's view is that man is made in God's image. That was Abraham's realization, that each one of us is meant to be godly. And the more godly we become, the more we can relate to our Creator. Paganism is the opposite. It views God being made in man's image, meaning people felt the world was run by a myriad of different forces or gods. These forces or gods had all the faults and weaknesses of man. They got angry. They were jealous. They were arrogant. They had their temptations, etc. The job of human beings in this concept is to appease these gods so they can get their bounty or rewards. From the Torah point of view, we have man being made in God's image. The worldview is that life is purposeful. Each one of us has a destiny, and the goal is to improve ourselves and bring out godliness within us to make this world a better place. Paganism, again, is the opposite. Life is chaotic. It really has nothing to do with human beings down below. We are just doing whatever we can to get the most out of life. Just end up pulling the right levers or hope to pull the right levers to get blessings and rewards. Basically, the Torah's view is that we are important to making the world a better place, which is our job. Paganism says we are minor players in the world and is actually the gods that struggle to make the world a better place. We just try to appease them along the way, but it's really all about the gods. We are like animals, not really significant in the grand scheme of things. So these are two different worldviews. Now, a central concept in Judaism is free will. The belief that each one of us is completely free to choose between the desire for good and the temptation for bad, aspire for greatness or to become evil. Therefore, in order to be able to make the choices fairly, we must be equally weighted between good and evil. So there needs to be free will tension. The two sides must be equally slated. In order to achieve greatness from a Torah point of view, it is prophecy. That is the highest level one can achieve, is to communicate directly with God. Conversely, the absolute evil would be giving in to idol worship, to submit yourself to a force that doesn't exist. So we have a problem. The men of the Great Assembly said, look, here we are with a new temple because we went into exile due to our desire to worship idols. Here, we just came back after 70 years in Babylon and a pagan culture. The Jews were immersed in a pagan culture, and we lost 10 tribes during the First Temple period. So we are weaker spiritually as a nation. If the temptation to worship idols still exists, there is no way we're going to survive the Second Temple era without giving in again to the temptation to worship idols. Therefore, the Sanhedrin basically said, let's take away that drive or strong temptation. The Talmud tells us that the Sanhedrin performed a special service to get rid of the temptation to worship idols. Now, obviously, it's hard for us to understand now, but it was a type of lust. You see, now we are surrounded by monotheistic religions like Islam and Christianity, so the environment around us makes it more difficult to worship idols due to the dominance of monotheistic religions. In the ancient world, this was before Islam and Christianity, where pagan culture was the norm. So the Sanhedrin performed a special service to diminish the lust to serve idols. However, in order to retain the free will tension, God had to remove something on the side of good to maintain balance. Again, we have to be able to make choices fairly. So that ability to attain prophecy was lost to the Jewish people. There was no more temptation for idol worship, but we lost the ability to attain prophecy. Now understand that this was a tremendous blow for the Jewish people. We no longer have individuals that can tell us what God wanted from us or what He wanted us to do. It was a tremendous loss of strength. So the Sanhedrin had two major innovations. First, they canonized the books of the prophets and the writings. They chose the prophecies they felt were relevant for the Jewish people for all generations. They canonized them as our holy texts. There was a second innovation. Understand that up until the Second Temple period, people prayed to God at least once a day in their own words, and that was the mitzvah prayer. The members of the Great Assembly felt that after the exile in Babylon for 70 years, where the dialect was Aramaic and they were exposed to pagan culture, the Jewish people lost the ability to pray in Hebrew with the proper mindset that a Jew would direct themselves towards God. So they wrote down for the first time a prayer known as the Amidah prayer. Amidah literally means standing. So it is where we stand with our feet together as we address God. It's also known as the silent prayer. Not that it is literally silent, because we have to speak when we pray. Thinking is not prayer. We speak, but only at a volume where we can hear ourselves. So it's silent to everyone else. It is also known as the Shemona Esrei. In Hebrew, Shemona Esrei means 18. It was originally composed of 18 various blessings. Later on, the rabbis added a 19th blessing. And I'll go over this prayer because it is one of the most common in Jewish history. So the first 3 blessings are praise. The next 13 are various requests. The last 3 are expressions of gratitude. This is the basic form when addressing God. We always begin with praise and acknowledgement of who we are speaking to. Then it is appropriate to make various requests. Then conclude with expressions of gratitude. These are the 13 requests. First is the request for intellect and wisdom. Second is repentance. Then we ask forgiveness for things we've done wrong. Then we ask for personal redemption to help rid us of personal worries. Then we ask for health. Then we request prosperity. Then we request the gathering of exiles back to Israel. Then we request restoration of justice where we feel we can truly rely on the court system. Then we request for the removal of heretics. This was actually the blessing that got added later on in history when many Jews started to have ideas which led to the spawning of other religions. Then we request strength for the righteous. Then we request for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Then we request for the arrival of the Mashiach, the descendant of King David. And finally, the request for acceptance of our prayers. So that is the Amidah prayer in a nutshell. The Sanhedrin, by composing this prayer at the point where we are about to lose access to prophecy, is now giving every Jew to stand before God in a pure Hebrew with the perspective of the greatest prophets and judges of Israel. So the needs weren't just personal needs, but needs that would affect the entire nation of Israel throughout history. And again, I'm just scratching the surface, but now we've covered the first 2,000 years of Jewish history, and we've covered the next 1,500 years of Jewish history. In my next presentation, we'll go over the next 800 years of Jewish history to complete phase 1, Jewish civilization. Thank you all so much for tuning in to Blade Talk. If you found this presentation helpful, informative, do me a huge favor and hit that like button. Do me an even greater favor and subscribe to my channel. I always appreciate all the support that I am given. Thank you all so much. Be good to yourselves, be good to others, and until the next presentation, you all take care.